Welcome to the Animal Training Academy podcast show. I'm your host, Ryan Cartledge. I know that you're here because you want to master your animal training skills using a force-free approach. And to handle the variety of challenges you face, you need a broad knowledge and experience base. The problem is, we all get stuck and hit rough patches in our training, which can leave us feeling overwhelmed and helpless. Our mission since 2015 is to empower trainers just like you. The Animal Training Academy has helped thousands of trainers globally to develop skills, gain confidence, and positively influence both animal and human learners. Here's how we can do the same for you. Sign up for our membership waitlist at www.atamember.com. Register when our doors open email arrives and start growing your training skills. Build impactful training practices benefiting you and those you train. So join the waitlist at www.atamember.com. And while waiting, enjoy this free podcast show. We want to see you avoid embarrassment, overwhelm, and burnout. Instead, we want to see you build resilience to setbacks, get more organized, and grow your training skills and knowledge. In short, we want to see you enjoy confidence in yourself as a trainer and lead a fulfilling life, positively impacting the lives of the animal and human learners you work with. But we will start today's episode where we will be talking to one Hannah McGee. Hannah is a certified Canine Behavior Consultant, currently pursuing her master's degree in behavior analysis at the University of North Texas under Dr. Jesus Rosales-Ruiz. She serves as an instructional specialist at Behaviour Explorer, collaborating with Mary Hunter to design the Shaping Skills Workshop and promote Portal. Additionally, she teaches an undergraduate course at the University of North Texas, where students gain insights into the application of behavioral technologies through various animal training projects. Hannah's ongoing research delves into understanding what animals' behavior reveals about their environmental experiences, with a specific focus on the concepts of assent and coercion in animal training. She possesses a deep passion for helping trainers improve their skills to enhance interactions with animals by first refining their own behavior. Through her work, Hannah aims to bridge the gap between academic research and the practical application of behavior analysis, firmly believing that with the right tools, any animal trainer can also be a scientist. So without further ado, it's my very great pleasure to welcome Hannah to the show today, who's patiently waiting by. Hannah, thank you so much for taking the time to come and geek out with us at Animal Training Academy.
Hi, Ryan. Thank you so much for having me.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm glad that we set this up, and I'm excited about this episode for all of you out there, the fantastic listeners of our show, focused on mastering your personal animal training skills using the most positive, least intrusive approach. We know that to truly excel in this field, it's not just about the how, but also the why, the what, and the science behind it all. However, understanding academic insights and how they apply to your hands-on training can be a hard bridge to gap. And it can sometimes leave us feeling confused and potentially like we're lagging behind. Thankfully, today's guest, Hannah, straddles both worlds. With her background in academia, alongside industry legends like, as mentioned in her bio, Dr. Jesus Rosales-Ruiz and Mary Hunter, and her hands-on experience as a certified dog trainer, she's the perfect guest. Currently, in the midst of her master's research, Hannah has taken a keen interest in a term that we mentioned in her bio and that perhaps many of us aren't super familiar with, but one that is crucial to understand, and that is assent. A-S-S-E-N-T, assent. Hannah is here to demystify this term for you and highlight three vital points about this concept, bridging the academic practical divide. Let's dive in. Hannah, what's the first thing we need to know about assent?
I think, first of all, what is assent, right? This might be a new word for a lot of listeners. And it was definitely a new word for me when I first started getting into this research. And so we've all probably heard the word consent before. And consent is actually a legal term. With consent, we're talking about a single instance of saying yes or no, right? So like my dog recently got her teeth cleaned at the vet. And when I dropped her off, I signed a form saying, yes, you can clean my dog's teeth. You can go through these procedures. Or a lot of us might have some sort of consent for the training we're doing. If we're consulting with owners and their animals, we might, before we provide services, ask, do you consent, and have them sign a form. So when we're talking about consent, it's really a legal term, and it's that one time kind of yes or no. And so in most legal systems, animals and children, in the US at least, children under the age of 18 can't legally consent. And so that's where this word assent comes in, right? Because for our animals, when we're getting ready to do a training session, we can't exactly ask them yes or no, do you want to go through with this training? So instead we have assent, which is an ongoing kind of continuous monitoring of the animal's behavior and of the animal's willingness to participate in the session with us. And so with assent, we're continuously looking for signs that the animal is a willing participant and does want to be participating in this training. But then the other side of assent is that it can be withdrawn at any time. So if at any point during the session the animal is no longer comfortable or no longer wants to be participating, they have the power and they can say, let's stop, and we need to readdress something in the session. But so with assent, we're really looking at this ongoing, yes, I'm here, I want to be here, I'm having a good time, these are good things, or no, I need to stop. And we're allowing our animal to say that and communicate those things to us at any time during our training session.
So I remember when we connected last week and you said you wanted to talk about this, and I was saying, wait, Hannah, can you tell me, are you saying consent or are you saying assent? And that's why I chose to spell it out for you, the listener. Hannah, that's why I chose to spell it out for people to ensure that they picked up the word I was saying, because it might cue people, that's the assent part, to think that we're talking about consent. So is one of the differences between consent and assent the single occurrence of giving consent in consent versus the moment-to-moment, non-stop, multiple occasions, infinite occasions of consent giving? Is that what assented? And then with your vet example, you gave consent when you went there and signed the form. But then if you went home and changed your mind and you rang up the vet and was like, no, I don't want to do it anymore, would that fall into assent? Can you clarify these points for myself and the listeners?
Sure, yeah. So yeah, that's a big difference between consent and assent. Is consent tends to be that single yes or no occurrence. And you can withdraw consent as well, right? I could call the vet back and say, wait, no, I changed my mind. I don't want this procedure anymore. And I could withdraw my consent. But with assent, we are looking at that continuous ongoing check-in throughout the session of, are you still good with this? Is this still something you want to be doing? And with assent, we're leaving that room for the animal to communicate with us in that way of, I'm cool with this now. I'm happy with this now. But if something changes, they can also change and pull that back. And then if something changes again, they can give their assent again. And so it's kind of this dance we see during a training session, that continuous ongoing communication of, I'm okay with this, I'm not so much okay with this, oh, I'm okay with this again. And so we can get a continuous conversation going with our animal during a session.
So from the academia side of things, assent is vocabulary from the literature that has an agreed upon definition?
Yes and no. So assent is kind of a new term that's come up in the last couple of years. Traditionally, people were talking about consent in multiple ways. So the word consent was being used both as this legal term of yes or no, and it was being used as that continuous buy-in, or that continuous, yes, I want to be here, no, I don't want to be here during a session. But in recent years, these have kind of been separated out and saying, right, consent is a legal term. So when we're doing research, we need to get consent from, if we're working with children, from their parents, or animals from their owners. But assent is, instead of that like legal yes or no, assent is a way to describe that difference between the two of, now we're looking at during a session, ongoing, you have the right to say yes or no at any point. You have the right to start the session or stop the session at any point. And that doesn't mean, like, say we're doing research, that doesn't mean you're saying, no, I don't want to be a participant in this research at all. That's just saying assent. Withdrawing assent is saying, I need a pause, I need a break here, or I'm uncomfortable with something here. And then if we change something, we can get assent again if the individual is okay with the changes we made.
And so just to help the listeners understand your current journey with Assent, you are looking into, tell me if I'm wrong, this with your current master's thesis. Do you want to share with the listeners what you're doing?
Sure. So in the research I'm currently doing, because this word assent has gained a lot of popularity in the last couple of years, and also, as a whole in the field of behavior analysis and in animal training, we're trying to progress and move towards having better, environments and better interactions with our learners, and having these clear ways of communicating what we are and are not okay with is really important for that. And so the research I started doing with Jesus Rosales-Ruiz, looking at assent, is we are looking at how giving our animals choices during sessions affects whether or not they want to participate in sessions. And when I say if they want to, I'm meaning if given other alternatives, if given other choices, are you still coming and participating in this session that I've set up? Or are you still coming and being a participant in these procedures that I have? And so within our research, we're looking at, what does it mean to have those choices during sessions? How many choices there are, what those choices lead to, how do all of those things affect what we're calling assent? And then in what ways can we get more assent? Like, say we have a learner who's not wanting to participate in our training. Are there things we can do to get them to want to participate? And when we do those things, does it still fall under having assent, or in those cases, are we possibly using some coercion? And is this maybe looking like assent, looking like what we might call assent, but it might not actually fit the definition of assent? And so through our research, we're trying to really parse out kind of what, we have this word that can be kind of complex, kind of mysterious, but what actual contingencies are involved in figuring out if we have a learner's assent, and what contingencies do we need to provide during the training session to ensure that our animals have the ability to assent and withdraw that assent at any time.
And when you say this word is gaining a lot of popularity, where the listeners of the show try to bridge the gap here between where Hannah is sitting with Dr. Jesus Rosales-Ruiz in his office talking about her thesis, and you as a practical applier going into people's homes and working with them and their animals, or maybe you're working in a zoo context or a vet clinic, wherever you're working. Are you seeing it that is gaining popularity in both of those spaces? Or when you say that, are you saying it's gaining popularity in the academic space?
Yeah, it's a great question. When I say that, it's probably more that it's gaining popularity in the academic sense and in the side of behavior analysis that works with humans. As most of the listeners are aware, in behavior analysis, in the scientific literature, there's been some ethical problems in the past, right? We're still a very young science, and things that were going on in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s aren't things that we're necessarily ethically okay with in 2023 now. And a lot of what was going on early on did not involve having participant assent. And a lot of what was going on was kind of forcing people into being participants or being, in research, they call them subjects. And so we're using this person, this human being, as a subject to gain information about behavior and about how we interact with the world. But does that person really have a choice here? Does that person really actually want to be involved with what we're doing here? And in a lot of cases, I think the answer historically to those questions would have been no. And so now the field is becoming more concerned about this. We want to be good to ourselves and good to our field, good to our science, but also good to our participants or our subjects, and those, whether they're humans or animals. We want to make sure that ethically our practices are sound as well. And we're not just concerned about getting the results of the experiment, but also about the experience of the individual during the experiment. And so Assent is becoming a way for us to see, okay, if I'm doing research with a child participant, yes, their parents consented to them being in this study, right? We got the signature, we got a yes. But is the child assenting? Do they actually want to be here? Are they okay with these procedures? And those are really important questions. And that bleeds into the work we do with animals too, right? It's becoming more important to us that we can give our animals choices and that our animals have power and have a voice during our sessions. And giving the ability for the animal to assent or withdraw that assent is a great way for us to check ourselves to see if our practices are sound and good.
For the people listening who you as an individual listener are going to be wherever you are on your journey and skill development and knowledge about behavior analysis, and words like choice often get paired with things like control. And I think there might be value before we continue this conversation just to offer those in this podcast. When you say choice, what really specifically do you mean? And the word contingency as well. I know that's for people at various levels of learning that can be a challenging word for some people to wrap their heads around. So let's take a pause to do some definitions before we move on, if that's okay with you, Heather.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's perfect. That's something we do a lot in academia too, is what are you actually meaning when you say this word that you're using? So first, when I say contingency, very broadly, I'm talking about that antecedent behavior consequence, right? Those ABCs that a lot of us are familiar with. But also when we talk about contingencies, in any given situation, there's usually a bunch of different contingencies we could be engaging with, right? In the traditional experimental sense, if you think of B.F. Skinner, he put a rat in an operant chamber in a box, and there's limited contingencies the animal can engage with there. But when we expand that operant chamber and think about this in these broader environments that we all work with animals in, there's a bunch of different contingencies, a bunch of different possible ABCs an animal could engage in that environment. And so when I say contingency, I'm talking about one of these possible behaviors, one of these possible antecedent behavior consequence relations that can occur in the environment. I'm referring to that. And then with choice is a very, very tricky word to define, and it's not defined well in the literature whatsoever. But when I'm talking about choice, I'm talking if given two options, A or B, whether you're picking A or picking B, you're making a choice between those two. And there are some kind of nuances to that I think we'll dig into as we get further into this conversation.
Awesome. And before we move on, because the three things that we want people to understand about the word assent today, the first thing is just understanding what assent is. And I think for the listeners of this show, and even for somebody who isn't a practical applier of the tools and the knowledge that we talk about on this show, they would likely understand why this is important. But in your words, Hannah, can you share with the listeners before we move on why understanding this is important?
For sure. So for me, as a researcher, and as a person who goes out and applies these principles and these concepts in my own work, I think that is important because as we progress in our knowledge about animal training, and as we try to offer our animals more opportunities to make choices during training session, and we want to possibly give our animals, more freedom to have a voice and to have a choice in our training sessions, it's important that we acknowledge that what we're really talking about in those situations is assent. And it's important that we acknowledge that there are some qualifying things when it comes to assent or when it comes to giving choices. And something we'll talk about today is that not all choices are necessarily created equal. And so what looks like a choice might not actually be a choice from our animal's point of view. And so if we're interested in increasing the freedom that our animals have, giving them a voice and giving them the opportunity to make choices, it's important for us to understand what that means and what it means for an animal to be able to assent and withdraw their assent. But then also with that, looking at this assent and this withdrawal of assent is a really informative way for us to get information about our training environment and about our training programs. And again, I think we'll get into some more details about what that means as we go on.
Awesome. Well, do you want to then please take us on to the second important thing that people need to understand about the word assent? You already touched on it briefly, but can you dive deeper into it? Tell us what it is.
Sure. So number 2, a big point when we're thinking about assent in animal training is that we need to be careful. We need to beware that assent can be coerced, and it can actually rather easily be coerced. So when we're going about training with this LIMA attitude, right, this LIMA approach, least intrusive, minimally aversive, for a lot of us, that means we're using positive reinforcement a lot. And positive reinforcement has kind of become a gold standard for a lot of us, which is a really good thing. But when we use positive reinforcement, we a lot of times assume the animal's having a more positive experience than if we were using other techniques, right? And we assume that if we're using positive reinforcement and our animal is continuously coming to the session and continuously engaging in this training, that the animal's making a choice to do that, and the animal's choosing to participate, choosing to come and participate in our positive reinforcement training. However, when we look at the literature with this, and Dr. Israel Golddiamond has a lot of work on this and talks a lot about coercion in teaching and in training. And Golddiamond talks about how we can actually use positive reinforcement coercively, even though we might not think that, even though it might not look like that, we can use positive reinforcement coercively. And so what does that look like? Well, if there's only one way to access a reinforcer, the animal does not actually have a choice in that environment. And so from Golddiamond's perspective is that if there's only one way to access a reinforcer, or if we're restricting a reinforcer in order to use it for a session, that's actually coercive use of positive reinforcement. And even though it might look like our animals are making a choice to participate in that situation, if there's only one way to access that reinforcer and to access it, they have to participate, that's not actually a choice for the animal in that situation. And so an example from my own research with this, an experiment that Dr. Jesus Rosas Ruiz and I did with one of my rats named Puff, was looking at this coercive use of positive reinforcement and how it plays into this discussion of assent. And so with Puff, what we did was we taught her kind of a communication system during training sessions. So one of the things we taught her was that we would present a basket at her cage, and if she hopped into the basket, she could come to the table, right? So we could call that a response that indicates assent. In us animal trainers, we also might talk about that as a start button, right? Puff jumps in the basket. She's pressing that start button saying, yes, I want to come to training. And so Puff could get in the basket and come to the training session, which took place on a table. And then while she's on the table, that basket's also available. And she could withdraw Assent, or she could hop back into that basket and get taken back to the cage anytime she wanted. So she could control when she came to sessions and when she left sessions. And then what we did was we gave her the option to earn food on the table. Super simple. All she had to do was go to a Target and there was food available at any time. But then things got more interesting when we restricted this food. So if food was only available on the table, if she had to come to the table to get her food, we saw that she was assenting more. She was participating in sessions for longer, and she was also faster to assent. So when we present the basket, she'd hop in immediately and immediately assent to coming to the session. However, when we gave her another alternative way to get the food following Gold Diamond's advice, we made food available also in the cage. So she no longer had to come to sessions to get that food. We saw her no longer assenting to the training sessions. She was staying in the cage and eating the food in the cage rather than coming out and eating the food from the activity during training. And so in this situation, if we only looked at that one assent response, right, or that one start button response, Puff getting in the basket, we could make it look like Puff really wanted to come to sessions and really wanted to participate by restricting that reinforcer, right? If the only way for her to get the reinforcer was through participating, we saw a lot of assent. It looked like we had an animal who really wanted to participate in our training. But we gave her another alternative to stay in the cage and have the same food, and she chose that instead. And so when we're talking about coerced assent or coerced use of positive reinforcement, we can't restrict ourselves to just looking at that single contingency or that single ABC. And so a lot of us are using start buttons in training, which is amazing. But we can't just rely on that one start button response to know if we have an animal who actually wants to be there participating with us. And so in order to know if we actually have assent, and if we have assent that's free of coercion, we have to look at what other alternatives are available to the animal in this environment. And that will give us more information about whether or not they are actually coming because they want to participate in training, or if they're coming because there's no better alternatives.
As you're talking, I'm trying to think about human example. And the first thing that came to my mind isn't really a real example, but a hypothetical one where if you went to work and you got paid for going to work, but if there was also money freely available at home, would you go to work? And then I started to think about the Puff going to work, but Puff going to work for the food. And that helped me go, oh, that makes sense, where how it could be or how it fit in with the feelings I have around when I think about coercion. And a lot of people consent to go to work, but they don't have other choices in terms of how to access the reinforcer money.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you can think of, or if you know of any other human examples where people might not be aware of their lack of contingencies, of their lack of choice. Can you think of any?
Yeah, I mean, it's happening all the time to us, really, right? When we talk about coercion, and the way coercion is talked about in the literature, is really, we're never going to be totally free of coercion in our lives. There's always going to be some alternatives that are better than others for different reasons. And so one example I'm thinking of is I live really close to a grocery store, but that grocery store is more expensive than another grocery store that's halfway across town. And so I usually choose, and I say choose with heavy quotation marks, I usually choose to go to the grocery store that's right next to my house, even though if that other grocery store was also right next to my house, I would be choosing to go to the different store. But this is where giving these different options or giving these different alternatives can give us really good information about our training or about our environment, is that if I lived next to both grocery stores and I was choosing to go to the less expensive grocery store, that tells us something really significant about the more expensive grocery store, right? But if we put that less expensive grocery store halfway across town, I'm going to keep choosing to go to the more expensive one because it's right there, right? But those aren't really equal choices. Dr. Israel Golddiamond would talk about this as not really having a genuine choice in the matter. And so when there's different features of different environments or different programs, different features of these different alternatives, those can affect whether or not the animal is choosing to engage in a certain alternative over another. And so we need to be really sensitive to, okay, are these actual equal or as equal as we can get options here? Or is one option kind of inherently better than the other? And if that's the case, then we're not really giving a choice in this situation.
So when the grocery store moved into Puff's house, Puff chose not to leave home to go to the grocery store. Can you think about other animal training examples that genuine choice is not available?
Sure. I think a lot of the times, I mentioned start buttons, right? And so we might teach our animal, okay, if you touch this target, that means let's use nail trimming. If you touch this target, that means we're going to continue with this nail trimming procedure. And if we do this nail trimming procedure and you let me get through a certain number of steps, I'll give you a treat. And so it looks like our animal presses the start button. We, manipulate their hand, trim a toenail, and give them a treat. And then they press the target again, and we go through that process again. It looks like our animal is choosing to participate with us and choosing to interact with that program. But if we gave them another alternative to get that same treat, would they still be pressing that start button? And that's the important question we have to ask here. And that's, I think, the piece that we miss a lot, right? We're giving start buttons, which is great. That's a start. But we need to make sure that maybe we have 2 start buttons or that there's something else there so we know that the animal pressing this start button is not a coerced choice in that way.
What's your thoughts for the listeners of this show who have cooperative behaviours trained with their charges, with their animals that are in their care? They have limited resources. They can acknowledge that there's no choice, no genuine choice. Tell me if I can use these words more accurately with the nail trim. So I can even think about my own animals, and Phoebe's lying next to me. When we trim her nails, there's only one way to earn chicken. It is to lie down on her side still while I trim her nails. I feel okay with this because of my limited resources, running a business, being a father, and just needing to get her nails done. What do you have to say to the listeners of the show who are in my position, who might be freaking out right now, going, "Oh my God, I need to give more choices to all my animals in all my areas"? Do we need to do that? What's your advice to people who are freaking out right now?
Right. Yeah, that's another amazing question. And bottom line is that if the procedure you have is working and it is not outwardly aversive to the animal, and if your dog is lying on their side, asleep, letting you trim their nails for that piece of chicken, that is amazing. You're doing an amazing job as a trainer. I have no issue with that. The issue comes up is like you said, if we're talking about genuine choice, if we're really wanting to know if we're giving our animals a choice, and if we really want to know if your dog likes being on their side for the nail trim or is happy to be there letting you trim their nails, then we need to give this other alternative or some other alternatives to kind of build this communication system. So I don't see this idea of multiple alternatives or alternative contingencies. I don't see this as something that you need to do or else you're a horrible trainer. No, nothing like that. This is just if we're interested in talking about choice with our animals, if we're interested in knowing if we have our learners assent, then we need to do some special preparations to ensure that the choices we're getting are actually genuine choices and not a coerced choice. Which, and again, like I said, if the situation, if your setup is working for you and your animal, and you are both happy and benefiting with your current setup, that's amazing. You don't have to change anything. But if you want to know if your animal does actually want to participate in the nail trimming procedure, then if you give them another way to earn chicken, that'll give you a very clear answer about whether they're participating in this nail trimming exercise because they're okay with the program, they're okay with the training, or if they're only participating because that's the only way to get chicken.
My feelings are that with nail trims, a lot of learners may choose an alternative way to get chicken if given that option. I think Phoebe would, this is a conversation we've had on this podcast show before about Phoebe and nail trims and on this topic with Dr. Joe Lang talking about something which I'm excited to talk about with you soon, degrees of freedom. And I thought it was important, Hannah, to just share what you just shared. So thank you for sharing it. Because I said to Joe, so do I need to train all of these things with my current resource availability and care and protection that I give to myself as a human learner, and looking after the stress that comes with feeling like you're not doing enough?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer was what you just said. So I'm really grateful to you for sharing that. I think that was an important and valuable piece to add into this part of the conversation. We've talked about what Assent is. We've talked about how Assent may be coerced, but you've prepared three important things that we need to understand about the word Assent. So I'm excited, and I hinted towards what the third thing is just then, but I'm excited to talk about number 3. So can you take us there, please, Hannah?
Yes. So number 3 on our list of important things to know about Assent today is that we can see or we can test if we are training without coercion by increasing degrees of freedom. And so like you said, you've talked on the podcast before with Dr. Joe Lang about degrees of freedom. But for listeners who might not be familiar, degrees of freedom, very broadly, is this term that that Dr. Israel Golddiamond introduced to us. And very broadly, degrees of freedom means that there's more than one way to access the same reinforcer. So in our nail trimming example with Phoebe, if she can earn chicken by lying down and having her nails trimmed, or say you give her an alternative to touch a target and earn chicken by touching the target, with those two options, we could say that Phoebe now has 1 degree of freedom. And so as we increase degrees of freedom, Golddiamond says we're decreasing coercion. And so we can use this to check to see if our training is free of coercion by seeing, okay, if I give you another alternative to earn your chicken, are you still participating in nail trims, or are you now taking this new alternative to get your chicken? And if you're taking the alternative, that tells us nail trims were likely being coerced, which again might not, using coercion does not mean you're a terrible trainer or a terrible human being. It's a natural process. We're all taking advantage of it all times. But if we want to be able to evaluate our training plans or our training procedures, giving these degrees of freedom or increasing degrees of freedom is a very practical way to do that.
And you had some examples from the research, I believe you're going to share with us. Is that correct?
Yeah, sure. So Dr. Jesus Rosales-Ruiz and I have done a second set of experiments with another rat named Perry based on what Puff taught us in our first round of experiments. And so with Perry, we wanted to explore this idea of degrees of freedom more and see, okay, what happens to Assent if we increase degrees of freedom? How does this affect our learners' Assent during training? And so with Perry, she had a similar setup to Puff, but we changed a few things. So for Perry, I would pick her up and bring her to the table for sessions. I would pick her up from the cage and place her on the table. So she did not have a choice of starting sessions. But once she was on the table and sessions began, she had multiple choices during sessions. So the first choice we gave her was that she could hop on this platform and get chocolate pudding. And for those of you who have never worked with rats, they love sugar. They love sweet things. So chocolate pudding is like, oh my God, I will do anything for chocolate pudding. So all Perry had to do was hop on this platform and we'd give her chocolate pudding, remove the chocolate pudding. She'd jump on the platform, chocolate pudding would come back. And if Perry jumped on the platform and ate chocolate pudding 5 times, then our session would be over and I'd pick her up and take her back to the cage. And so we taught her that. And then we gave her a tunnel on the table as well, so she could also hide during sessions if she wanted to. And so with these 2 options, when we looked at data from sessions, we saw that when the tunnel was there, she was spending a large amount of time in the tunnel. And when the tunnel wasn't there, she was spending a lot of her time trying to figure out how to escape from the table. She was looking over the edge, trying to kind of gauge if she could jump and reach nearby objects. She was trying to grab onto me, the experimenter, trying to pull at my clothes. And we're really curious because looking at her data, she continued to participate in this response to get pudding. She would continue to jump on the little platform and get pudding, but she was also engaging in these other behaviors, which led us to think that, something else is going on here. Something about this environment might be a little aversive. Something's happening because she's engaging in that response, but we're still getting escape and we're still getting a lot of hiding. And so the next thing we did was we increased Perry's degrees of freedom and we gave her free access to pudding. And so now she could jump on the platform and get pudding that way. Or there was a little bowl of pudding that she could go to and eat as much pudding for how long she wanted to, no strings attached. But when we gave her this option for free pudding, out of all the sessions, she only went there and tried it twice. And for only a couple seconds, just very brief little eating the pudding, and then would immediately go to the platform and engage in the task to get pudding. And we still saw a ton of hiding and a ton of escape behaviors during those conditions. So we increased degrees of freedom, but it didn't actually seem to do much for the aversiveness of the situation for Perry. And we also saw a contra freeloading effect. And for listeners who might not be familiar, contra freeloading is this phenomenon that's been demonstrated with rats and pigeons in labs, and also a variety of zoo animals in more applied settings. And in contra freeloading, what happens is that an animal is given the option to perform a task for a reinforcer or get the same reinforcer for free. And the phenomenon is that we continuously see the animals go and perform the task instead of eating the free pudding or instead of eating the free reinforcer, which kind of goes against what we think we know about the principles of reinforcement and how reinforcement works, right? An organism should be engaging in the fastest way, easiest way possible to get to that reinforcer. However, we have a lot of literature saying that when given the option, animals prefer to engage in an activity or a task to earn that same reinforcer. So we saw this effect with Perry, but like I said, we still saw a lot of hiding and a lot of trying to escape from the table. So this made us pause and say, okay, something else is going on here. And so again, following Gold Diamond's advice, we looked at what other contingencies are going on in this environment. And when we look at those options that were set up to Perry, right, she could hide in her tunnel, she could eat pudding for free out of the bowl, or she could engage in this task. There's actually another contingency that we overlooked at first. If Perry engaged in the task, and if she did it 5 times, session ended and she got to go back to the cage. And so we said, okay, let's manipulate that variable. So what we did was we they're called reversals, where in one condition, pudding from the task, from the platform, led to going back to the home cage. And in the next condition, eating from the free pudding led to going back to the cage. And then we alternated between those two conditions. And what we very quickly saw was that Perry was choosing the alternative that led to getting back to the cage. So if we made free pudding, eating from the bowl, if we made eating from the bowl equal going back to the cage, she would exclusively eat free pudding. If we switched it and made going back to the cage contingent on participating in the task, she only participated in the task. And so that told us that, well, we thought we were training with positive reinforcement. We thought this pudding was working as a positive reinforcer here, but actually we've got a lot of negative reinforcement going on, and escape is what was important to Perry in this environment. And so then from there, we gave Perry multiple degrees of freedom for escape. So now she could engage in the task, or like we did with Puff, we gave her that basket. And so she could just, when I put her on the table, if she didn't want to be there, she could hop in the basket and immediately go home. And sure enough, when we gave her that option, she did not eat any pudding at all. She would immediately get in the basket and go home. And so in this example, it shows how important it is to use that arrangement of different contingencies as a way to get information about what's important to our learner, right? So when we started, we gave degrees of freedom for pudding. We gave multiple alternatives to get pudding, but that didn't really have an effect on Perry. And again, because we were being silly humans, and we just looked at, one or two of the contingencies going on in this situation and didn't consider the alternative of escape. But then when we increased degrees of freedom for escape, we saw an immediate change in responding there as well. And so we were able to manipulate these different alternatives that were available to Perry and use this as a way to get information about, okay, do you like this task of jumping on the platform to get pudding? Or is there something else going on here? Or if I give you the option of leaving, would you rather leave? And sure enough, in Perry's situation, she would rather leave.
Very interesting learning opportunity for everyone, including Perry, who I appreciate. Might be like me, a little bit of an introvert and just want to go home sometimes. I want to give some practical options or things that the listeners can do when thinking about all of this. So the listeners of the show, they care about this. They want to build their skill, build their knowledge, build their confidence in applying the tools that we talk about on this show. And they really love these episodes where they get to learn more about words like Assent and the research that you're doing and the academic source of the tools in practical application that we all practice. And so you're listening to this episode and you're thinking about your own animals and you want to learn and offer choice and learn specifically about more about what your animals actually want. What are 1, 2, 3 practical things that people can do to build their skills at applying in a meaningful way what we've been talking about today? Because I know that you're very big on building people's skills as well. What are some approximations that people can take?
Yeah. So to start approximating this with your own animals in your own work, first step is to be aware of the different contingencies going on. And so it can be really beneficial to sit down with pen and paper and diagram out those ABCs and think about, I have that main, let's take a targeting response, right? Animal, I present the target, animal touches the target, they get a treat. I have that main ABC I'm concerned with, but what other ABCs are going on in this environment? What other contingencies are functioning in this environment? Just take a moment to sit down and draw those out. What do all of those look like? Can you think of some that maybe you haven't thought of before? Because that's a first step in just seeing, okay, from my animal's point of view, what does this whole situation look like? What does this whole situation feel like? But then from there, the easiest thing to do is to try giving alternatives to get that same reinforcer. So if, we go back to Phoebe's nail trimming example, if we also teach Phoebe that she can touch a target and get chicken, and now let's present these options together and have them both available in the training session. Play around with what it looks like, what it feels like to give the animal options. And then when you do give those options and you see your animal say, yeah, I want to do nail trimming, go back to your diagram of ABCs that you made and think about how are these different contingencies interacting together? If I have restricted chicken for a week and it's been a week since Phoebe got chicken, how might that be affecting whether or not Phoebe's engaging in this nail trim or not? But think about, as you increase those options, think about how all these different options are working together and affecting each other in the same training environment. I think that's a big one as well.
As you were saying, I had something that I really wanted to bring up, but it's gone from my thoughts, so can't be that important. Let's head towards the end of this episode now then, Hannah. Do you want to offer any final thoughts on Assent before we do so?
Sure. So I think as this word becomes more and more popular and I think it will become more and more popular in animal training, just as it has become popular in the side of behavior analysis that works with humans. As we move towards wanting to give our animals more options and more choices during training, it's really important to think about how those options interact with each other and what outcomes those options lead to. And, it's one thing to give options, or give choices, but if those aren't genuine choices, then are we just going through the motions? Are we doing that because it makes us look good as trainers, or are we actually doing it because we want to give our animals a genuine choice? I mean, are we doing that because we genuinely want to know if our animals enjoy the procedures we're using or the different styles of training we're trying to use? And if we want to know if our animals are actually choosing to participate and do want to work with us, giving them alternatives and making sure that those alternatives are free of coercion is the way we're going to do that. And so like we mentioned earlier, if you don't provide alternatives in every single training session and during every single training procedure, that's not a bad thing. That's perfectly okay. But if we are interested in this question of what our animals want, what they prefer, what they enjoy, then we do have to be really sensitive to these different alternatives available to them in the environment.
Well, thank you, Hannah, for the wealth of information you've shared. I have one last question for you, one I love asking all of our guests. Could you please, before we finish, share with us what you would love to see happen in the animal training world over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, in the next 5 to 10 years, really, I would love to see more of a merger between the academic side of things and the applied side of things. In behavior analysis, especially behavior analysis that works with humans, we talk about scientist practitioners. And the idea is that you are both a scientist using that literature, using that knowledge we have, and you're applying this and using it practically and making an important difference in the lives of others. And I would love to see this idea expand into animal training. I would love to see scientist trainers, And I think a lot of the time when we think about research or we think about the academic scientific side of things, we might have these images in our minds of, the experimenter in their lab coat with a pigeon or a rat in a skitter box. Or we think of the ethologist out in the field with a notebook quietly observing, right? But really, I think we can all be scientists and all be researchers in the work we're doing, especially if you work with captive populations, like in a zoo or in an animal shelter, where you have access to a large number of animals in a relatively consistent environment. All it takes to be a scientist and be a researcher is to control certain variables in the environment and manipulate specific variables at the same time. And I think if we merge these two worlds more, it can only benefit us and only improve our ability to use what we're learning from the research and apply that information, but also get the application of it out there quicker. I think a lot of the times we're waiting 20 or 30 years till we actually take something that's in the literature and use it in an applied setting. But if our people in applied settings are being systematic and approaching their work from, hey, okay, can I get some data from this? Can I use this to see a systematic change in, I'm using this procedure and this behavior happens. Now I change this part of the procedure and this behavior happens. We can open up those discussions a lot more, and I think progress a lot more if we're working together and keeping those lines of communication open.
That is a future that I want to be a part of. Before we conclude, can you just let our audience know where they can go online to see your work with Mary Hunter, research you've done, anything else you've got online, and reach out if they have any questions?
Yeah, so you can get in contact with me either through Behavior Explorer, or I'll give Ryan my email that we can link in the show notes. So please reach out to me if you have any questions or comments or anything related to how this applies to your work. I would love to hear it. Also, I've provided that, I think we'll link in the show notes, an article, a recent article from Awab Abdul Jalil and some other great people working in behavior analysis, talking about Assent and talking about degrees of freedom. And that article has a lot of great, really practical examples of what this looks like with both human and animal learners. So I encourage listeners, and it's a really easy read too. It's not super academic and jargony. So it's a great before you're going to bed kind of read. So I encourage listeners to take a look at that article as well. And yeah, get in contact with me if you have any other questions or comments.
Excellent. Well, ensure those details are in our show notes. It's been a pleasure having you on the show today, Hannah. And on behalf of all of our listeners, thank you for gracing us with the wealth of information you've shared.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a blast.
And thank you as well so much for listening. This is your host, Ryan Cartledge, signing off from this episode of the Animal Training Academy podcast show. It's our hope today's conversation sparked inspiration and added some tools to your trainer's toolbox. Remember, every training challenge is an approximation towards becoming a better trainer. Embrace the rough patches, learn from them, and keep improving. And don't forget, the path to growing your skills and expanding your knowledge continues beyond this episode. Visit www.atamember.com to join our waitlist and be the first to know when our membership doors open again. There you'll find a supportive community of trainers just like you, working to make a positive difference in the lives of animals and humans alike. Until next time, keep honing your skills, stay resilient, and remember, every interaction with an animal or human learner is your opportunity to create ripples. We're here cheering you on every step of the way. See you at the next episode.